make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Just no question in my mind that this is almost impossible to implement logistically. In like the form that Donald Trump is talking about. I think in terms of the normative argument, I think people would probably be surprised to know that non-citizens voted in the United States well into the 1920s. The last state to ban it was Arkansas in 1927. So, yeah, I mean, like, voting used to be open to all lawful residents of the United States. Well, I mean, and, like, lawful resident used to be defined very widely.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by my trusty sidekick and your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. What's up, Josh?
Hey, Will. Nothing's up. Hey, everything up and nothing up. I kind of thought you would move on from there, but I'm doing well. Thank you, Will.
Yeah, I thought there would be like, hey, Will, how's it going? Not just
how's it going, Will?
Not just like acknowledge your, But anyways, but hey, returning back to us is one of our favorite voting people, Jessica Huseman. She is the editorial director of VoteBeat, which is a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering voting access and election administration across the United States. And I will say, I get all of my election news through VoteBeat. They are a phenomenal organization, small, but very, very smart. So it's like, if there was ever a seat in the press briefing room for new media, I would hopefully expect VoteBeat to be there. Which, speaking of which, Jessica, have you guys applied for your new media pass?
I think that we'll probably talk about this today. But one of the beautiful things about voting is that the White House can't do anything about it. So our ability to get a question answered and have that be useful at the White House is almost zero. If we were allowed access as a alternative press or whatever to a gubernatorial office, I would be thrilled.
You'd be all over
beyond
it.
all reason, but that hasn't happened for us yet. So we'll see.
Yeah, I did apply for that just recently. I was on the fence because I was like, they're letting these like podcasters in there, just ask these really crazy questions, and I'm like, why not? Why not? And
you are at least as qualified as Tim Pool. You know what I mean?
We should definitely go up there, Will, and just like sit in on a press conference if we can get in. Are we able to do that?
Love that.
I think so. Here's the thing. I think you would probably actually have a little bit more credence. You're a white evangelical pastor. You're kind of right in that mold. You're conservative. Me going in there, I don't know, like I would probably feel a little
They would just welcome you with open arms, Josh. I think they would be like, yes, we have a special entrance for
until they thought I was a shepherd for sale, dude.
Yeah,
and I was so woke, and then it would be over.
That is true, because I've mentioned, and I figured this out over the years, Jessica, that I don't think most people that book people for guests on our show know what our show is. They just figure Faithful Politics, and they'd assume conservative, right-wing, religious, something. So like we'll get folks on the show that realize what the show is as we're talking to them. And yeah, it's always really fun because I don't know. I just like to see people be surprised in the show.
I mean, I think I'm conservative, but again, they might not. So I don't know. But yeah, I'll go in there. I'm white.
The Republican Party might be shifting under your feet here. So
there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
So, well, anyway, so you are still working. In the
Let's see if that continues. Yeah.
Normally we have you on closer to November, but there's just been kind of a lot going on. So I appreciate you coming back. We want to talk to you about a whole wide range of stuff like SAVE Act, Chris Krebs, executive orders, all that kind of stuff. So do you have a place that you prefer to start?
Oh my God, anywhere. It's all
Okay.
chaos. So just pick something out of that.
Let's start with the executive orders. How about that?
Great.
So
That sounds great.
Trump signed a executive order in March that required people to provide proof of citizenship to register using federal form. So can you just sort of unpack what that's all about, and then we can kind of talk about the larger implications?
Yes. So right now, federal law has established a consistent voter registration form that you can use in any state to register to vote in federal elections, right? So all of the things that are on the ballot during federal elections, that's what this is for. And that form right now requires you to prove your identity by either listing a partial social security number or a driver's license number. And so instead of that, right, essentially the administration would order the Election Assistance Commission, which is the agency that manages this form, to update the form to require documentary proof of citizenship. So it wouldn't just be a number, you would have to present in person with some paper documentation showing that you are a citizen of the United States. And that is not currently required. There are a couple of states that require some version of that, but not that strict. And then also there are states that require that for state voter registration. There's one state, Arizona, that requires it to register at the state level, but courts have ruled that they cannot use that at the federal level. So they have like a split voter registration system for federal and state elections. So that's what it is, right? Like we just sort of make more strict the way that you prove citizenship in the United States for voter registration.
So, just for all of us who are listening and we maybe, know about voting history in the United States, maybe we don't, we're very ignorant of it. Like, what are the pros and cons of this kind of thing? Like, is it like, what is there an issue with it? Is it bad business to do that? And if so, why? And kind of help us understand the controversial issues surrounding this.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Every year we hear about, one non-citizen that has cast a ballot, right? I think the most well-known example this year is a Chinese national who was a student at the University of Michigan who cast a ballot and then sort of told on himself immediately after. And he was like, oh, I cast a ballot. I don't think I was actually supposed to do that, right? And so he was prosecuted, and that's kind of ongoing in the state of Michigan. But that's one ballot, right, for the whole state of Michigan that we know to have been cast by a non-citizen. Other secretaries of state, especially in Republican states, have done really extensive surveys of non-citizens on the rolls. So Georgia, for example, found, I think, like 12 on the rolls in the entire state. So we're talking about like less than 0.0001% of registered voters. So this is a really small problem. I think that there are sort of like normative arguments that you can make about that being fundamentally incorrect, right? Like if you're a person who believes that voting in the United States should be completely restricted to citizens, you can make the argument like even one is too many, right? This is a right that we have as citizens. That is not like historically a particularly compelling argument for me, but it also means that you're saying this is so important that every single voter in the United States, even ones that have voted successfully since they were 18 years old and are 85 now, are going to have to go back to the voter registration office and present their documentary proof of citizenship. So even if you can make the argument that this is basically okay, and most people do have your proof of citizenship, like making that requirement of everyone that's on the voter rolls is a massive logistical challenge. And it also means that you're putting county clerks in a really weird position, right? So like, what does documentary proof of citizenship mean, right? Like maybe a passport. It's pretty easy to determine like what passport is real and what passport isn't. Those are, they come with internal things. But what's also available is a birth certificate, right? Like there was a whole national controversy not a decade ago because we don't have consistent birth certificate forms in the United States. So we're essentially saying to these county clerks, you need to be able to tell which birth certificates are forged and which are real and which aren't real. Like we do not have consistent identification in the United States. And so that is really awkward for clerks. And like, I don't know that we want to put clerks in that position. So, I think, yes, if we isolate the idea of the problem, like whether or not citizens should be able to vote in the United States and whether or not that's a problem, that can sort of be a different conversation as to like whether or not documentary proof of citizenship and requiring everyone to give you, like to present that documentation and the impact of that as a logistical challenge. I think those two questions can be separated out. And so I think there's just no question in my mind that this is almost impossible to implement logistically, in like the form that Donald Trump is talking about. I think in terms of the normative argument, I think people would probably be surprised to know that non-citizens voted in the United States well into the 1920s. The last state to ban it was Arkansas in 1927.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, like voting used to be open to all lawful residents of the United States. Well, I mean, and like lawful resident used to be defined very widely.
Yes.
We used to use voting, like even for new immigrants, as an inducement to move to the territories. So it really wasn't until the xenophobia that was sparked by World War I that we decided that voting was only for U.S. citizens. So it's just like foundationally, historically not true that the founders, for example, intended for citizens to be the only ones that voted, because citizens voted in this country for more than 100 years.
Wait, what? Like I literally had no idea, and I swear we could spend the rest of this episode just me learning.
I know this is my favorite fact about history, and so I think it's particularly surprising now because we talk about this like there's some provision of the Constitution that's like only U.S. citizens vote. That is not in the Constitution. Like there is no part of the Constitution that restricts voting to citizens. That is something that we have evolved into over time. And I'm not going to take a position, and I don't think it's my place to, as to whether or not that has been correctly decided, right, over in the course of history. But this thing that we all have decided is fundamentally part of being an American was not actually part of the American experience until after World War I.
That's pretty wild. And I'm curious about just the logistics of how you implement something like this. You were alluding to it a little bit earlier, but it's like an executive order doesn't necessarily come with funding.
No. Not at all. It
So
doesn't.
if you make a change, cost stuff. So I mean, what, and I'm not a constitutional scholar. I don't think there's one on this call. But how would that work? I mean, just fundamentally, how would president signing a document fundamentally change how we do elections in this country?
Right. Well, I think that there's a question as to whether or not this is even a thing that can happen, and the courts are deciding that, right? I think that I would be really surprised if the courts decided that the executive order in its current form can be enforced as written. It would seem impossible to me to do that. I think if we sort of assume that it's that the courts have just if we just pretend that the courts have decided this is fine and the states now have to implement this, there are a couple of ways that this could get done. But I think that you can learn from the attempts by states to do this, to understand that it's not it's not easy to do, and it tends to disproportionately impact younger voters and minorities because they move more, right? So like, for example, in Arizona, they have passed a documentary proof of citizenship law. So they have separate voter registration processes for state elections and federal elections. So a couple of months ago, VoteBeat did a big data analysis as to like who is most impacted by this. So essentially, which voters are not registered to vote at the state level and are registered to vote at the federal level because they can't present proof of citizenship, or they haven't, at least. And those voters skewed significantly younger than the rest of the population, and they were very much like centered in university towns, because like, what do you not have when you go to college? Probably your passport and your birth certificate. Like when I was in college, I don't even think I had a passport, and I don't think I could have told you where my birth certificate was if you held a gun to my head. You know what I mean? So these are like, that's the kind of thing that's going to happen here. And, you know, I also think that it's interesting, you know, Republicans are assuming that this is not going to impact them. But, you know, there are surveys that have been done that show that, like, if you ask somebody, do you know where your proof of citizenship is, like your birth certificate, your passport, whatever, the group of people most likely to say no are older Americans, and those tend to be Republicans. So, you know, I think that there's reasons it's skewed younger in Arizona. They sort of grandfathered people in. So if you've been registered to vote for a long time, you didn't necessarily need to do that. So that sort of exempted a lot of older people. But like you can kind of see how badly this is going to go. Kansas also tried to do this a few years ago, and there ended up being 30,000 people in this limbo where they like attempted to register to vote but didn't present documentary proof of citizenship. And so their voter registration was held, like just in limbo, until a federal court ruled that they couldn't enforce the law anymore, and then all of those people were automatically registered to vote. So
But I thought Kansas and Chris Kobach had like the best, you know, like election system in the country. Didn't Trump make him like the election czar or something?
You know, until that imploded on him, and well, you know what though, Chris Kobach has risen again. He is now the Attorney General of Kansas, and I'm sure he will be in a perfect position to enforce this law should it go forward. I don't know.
Quick tangent question, and then I know Josh has one. I forgot to ask you at the top, how's Walter?
Oh my God, he's so good. He's great. Okay. He's loving life. We have 2 new dogs next door, so he's just making friends and, you know, being his best.
And I'm assuming Walter, of course, is your dog.
Walter is my dog. Yes, Walter Cronkite is
just to make sure.
He is not just like my child that really likes the dog or anything.
Oh, sorry, I just had to throw some levity in there. So, okay, this let me throw out this kind of a conclusion from this executive order, and then I want to ask how some of this is going to be, like the implications of some of this. So, the idea is that the federal government should require, or is going to require, through this executive order, documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. And then, you know, we've kind of talked about what that means. Can a license work, or is that not, that's not my total question, but a license that doesn't work, or no?
That is a really good question. So there are a couple of states that have citizenship flags in the license system. And so the license, because it just happens to record that documentation, can be proof of citizenship. But the vast majority of states, that's not the case. And in fact, right, what constitutes proof of citizenship is a harder question to answer in the United States than in most countries. So in most countries, like all developed Western countries, and even countries like Mexico and India, when you are born, you are issued an ID. There is, as a result of that, like a list of every citizen of these countries somewhere, right? That can, like, the ID can be checked against. There is no list of United States citizens, not a one. We are not issued identification as a result of our birth, right? We are issued a social security number if we're born in a hospital, but some people aren't, right? Like, we're issued some form of non-photo identification, but like this mythical list of citizens that we're going to use to check voter registration against doesn't exist, right? And so the list of documents that are listed on that executive order include, for example, a passport. They include licenses in states where that is flagged. They include military IDs, right? But military IDs don't include information about citizenship either. And lots of non-citizens join the military. And you might think, oh, well, if you're in the military, you have a passport. That's not true, right? Like, if you are in the military, you can hop on a military plane without a passport. So, like, one of the groups that's going to be most negatively impacted by this is the military.
Wow. So, and then, but another part of this is withholding of funding from non-compliant states. Is that correct? So what does that mean? What funding is going to be withheld, and how is that going to affect states?
That's a really good question, because there is no federal funding for elections. Like, so like, I think people freaked out about this, but I didn't. I sort of read this part of the executive order and I was like, oh, wow, like, dozens of states aren't going to get dozens of dollars. Well, like, they're not, like, one of the things that election officials say constantly and all the time is that they're not getting enough federal funding. So, like, the federal funding we're dispersing to states was passed as a package as part of the Help America Vote Act of 2000. Like, we are still distributing that money 25 years later. Like, we passed additional funding for states for election security a couple of years ago. And I think the average disbursement to states was like $100,000, like, to the state of California. Like, this is not a life-changing amount of money. Wow. And so I think that even if this executive order were to go through in full, and I don't think that it will, states could easily and without much sacrifice be like, no, we're not doing this. And then that would just be it, right? And so, even I'm sure we'll talk about the sort of the voting machine, like, piece of the executive order, but even the system that he's asking to be updated is the voluntary voting system guidelines, right? Like, inherent in the name is voluntary. So, like, states do not have to do this, and they've never had to do this. And there's not much money behind getting them to do it, right? Like, I think we hear about these instances in the past, like, well, we wanted to, like, increase the drinking age to 21, and so we withheld highway funds. Like, that is a significant enough amount of money annually to sort of incentivize behavior on the part of the states. Like, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, like, not even $1 million for most states.
Yeah, I'm curious about the hardware or machine part, and did the executive order address sort of like the proximity to, like, Nest thermometers or anything like that?
You know what? I would have loved it if it did, because that would have made this much more exciting to write about. But unfortunately, no. All it did was ban the use of QR codes in vote tabulation, which is a thing, but it's not, like, that big of a deal. And, like, anyway, this is really not worth talking about, because it's like, it's a silly thing that he's required. That's, like, very much, a continuation of a conspiracy theory. But it's also like not that big of a deal. I think like the next iteration of America's voting machines wouldn't have used this technology anyway. And so saying like stop using this technology that nobody really likes is like not, it's sort of like we're banning floppy disks. Woo, you know, it's like it's just not like nobody gives a shit about this. Pardon my French.
Yeah.
Your French is pardoned.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm curious about, so they're kind of in the same vein, but a question that came to me actually just today was there was another executive order that established like English as the official language of the country. And I'm curious on like, will that affect voting, at least like how stuff is printed?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you know, I think he could make the argument, like, I don't know that one could make a real argument that an executive order invalidates existing federal law passed by Congress and signed by the president. So there are laws that have like contain formulas for what and how you must translate election materials. So if like a certain percentage of your population that is eligible to vote speaks a language, you must, under federal law, translate your ballots into that language. So, for example, in Dallas County, which is where I live, we have to translate the ballots into Spanish and Vietnamese. There are other places that have a lot more languages. And then there are places that sort of translate voluntarily into languages that they're not necessarily required to translate ballots into. So, like Los Angeles, I think, translates its ballots into like 40 different languages. And that's just something that Los Angeles chooses to do. And there are, for example, like places in Michigan that translate ballots into Arabic, even though federal law actually doesn't take into account Arabic as a language you should translate into because it's an old law. So there's a lot of weird stuff that goes into this. But like at bottom, states are going to do what states are going to do. And there's not much that the federal government can do about that. So there's nothing the federal government can do to prevent LA from translating its ballots into whatever language LA wants to translate its ballots into. So even if this executive order like we decide that it like, you know, is more important and surmounts federal law, which I doubt, states can still do whatever they want to do here.
So I didn't know about non-citizens being able to vote. It's absolutely fascinating, actually. Like that's like one of those trivia questions, like that you could totally get someone like fired up about, and then like prove them like wrong, and then they'll be like, "Oh man," and you know, just like really embarrass them. I don't know if you ever pull out that trivia on people, but if you don't, you definitely should.
I kill it our trivia. Let me tell you what.
I'm sure you do. But, you know, my question. So I don't have any problem personally with them saying, "Hey, only U.S. citizens legally here are allowed to vote." I don't have an issue with that. I'm okay to hear the arguments of people that do. That's fine, but I don't have an issue with that. I guess my question about this is requiring documentary proof of citizenship, is that going to prevent non-citizens from voting? And is there a better way to do so? Like, is this the most efficient way? Is this a good way to do it? Or, as you've been saying, it kind of seems like this is going to be kind of a disaster in some ways in terms of logistically. What would a better way to do it be that you think?
You know what? I don't know that there is a better way to do it, right? Like, I think that if we assume that this is a problem that must be solved, at some point we will have to require documentary proof of citizenship because, as I say, there is not this like beautiful, clean list of everybody who's a citizen in the United States, right? I think there are people who think that, you know, if the United States would just give states more access to citizenship information. We could just run our voter rolls against those databases and we would all just know the answers to, like, that's just really not how government data is stored or works. And there is no list of citizens. We do have a list of identified non-citizens that are in the United States, but that list isn't super up to date. People will become citizens and then stay on that list, right? And then also that list is only the people we know to be here as non-citizens. So it's people who hold green cards or people who have presented themselves to an immigration office in some capacity, right? And they go on this list. That's the list we have, right? And that's not fulsome enough to do sort of this automatic citizenship check like people think should be able to happen. And so I think the real, like, the baseline question is, like, is this problem such a problem that we must do this really disruptive thing? And I would say that the data suggests that it is not happening at a rate that would justify the cost that will be associated with this type of change, even if you assume, like, even if we agree that non-citizen voter registration is, like, fundamentally a problem.
You know, that's interesting because I haven't looked at the data as closely as you have, obviously, but I have looked at the Heritage Foundation's election data, which is like something I've been giving to friends when we have conversation. I was like, look, Heritage data, like to spend 5 minutes on it, see if you see any patterns, and then it's not long, and they're just like, oh, wait a minute, most of these are Republicans, you know, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, like, hey, I'm all for fixing problems, you know, but like let's just phrase the right problem so that way, you know, we are fixing it. But you know, I am kind of curious about your thoughts on the SAVE Act, since that is also somewhat connected to identification. So I'd love for you to maybe, one, just unpack what is the SAVE Act, and two, if you can address some of the concerns, especially like married women have about it.
Yeah, so the SAVE Act would function very similarly to what we've been talking about here, right? And it leaves a lot up to the individual states in terms of, like, what documentation they're willing to accept, how they manage problems between sort of, like, what if there's a legitimate reason why my name is no longer the one that I was born with, right? Like, I'm a married woman. I changed my name for, like, totally normal reasons. There are lots of reasons why somebody's name might not match the name on their birth certificate. And so I think people are really concerned about that. And the SAVE Act is basically silent on how it solves those issues, except to say that states need to and that they should.
Can you explain what the SAVE Act is?
Yeah, so the SAVE Act would basically require documentary proof of citizenship. And so it does very much similar thing. There are some smaller differences, but at base it is the same as what the executive order would require. And it has passed the House. It will almost certainly not pass the Senate. And so I don't think that this is likely to become law. But there's quite a lot of concern about how it will impact people who have changed their names. And you bring up married women. That's probably the most vocal group. But they're certainly not the only ones that are going to be impacted by this. So I think we will see, like, should this pass, it's gonna take some time for these things to become law, right? I think that people think, oh, the SAVE Act's gonna pass, and then magically I'm not gonna be allowed to vote if I don't have this document and this document. That's really not how it would work. So even if it did pass, right, states would have to pass their own legislation in order to, like, decide how it will be implemented in each state. And that's going to take time, right? Like it takes years for state legislatures to pass things through. Texas's legislature is about to close for the next year and a half, right? Like our legislature meets for 6 months, once every 2 years. So even if it passes tomorrow through the Senate, Texas isn't going to be enforcing it for another year and a half at least, right? And so, this is going to take a lot of time to roll out. Like this is a really big ship that we have to sort of like turn around very slowly.
So is a SAVE Act kind of like what the executive order should have been? like a piece of legislation that has a CBO, and all that, and kind of goes through the paces, or like is it just in addition to? Because the SAVE Act lived before the executive order, if I remember the timing, right?
The SAVE Act was sort of like in the works and being talked about and like through committee when the executive order was signed. And so the way that people thought about it is like, okay, so the SAVE Act is going to be the backstop for this executive order when this executive order is tossed out by the courts. I actually think it's the other way around. The executive order was meant to do what the SAVE Act did because the SAVE Act was never going to pass, right? And so this was Trump's attempt to do what he knew that the SAVE Act was never going to be able to do. Because I just don't think that there's a realistic path forward for it in the Senate, and there's really never been. And so the executive order was really the thing that they could get out without Senate approval, as it were. So the message was consistent.
So I want to move to this investigation into Krebs and kind of talk about Chris Krebs. And I would love for you to help our audience understand who is Chris Krebs. Why has he come under the ire and the target of this current administration, and what's going on with him?
So Chris Krebs was the first director of CISA, which is the I always forget. It's the Cyber
Infrastructure
Security Agency. Yeah. So
we'll go with that.
It's the agency that thinks about cybersecurity and cyber infrastructure in the United States for all of the government. And this was an agency that was stood up under the first Trump administration. So it's really important to keep in mind that Trump 1.0 selected Chris Krebs for this position and made him the head of an agency that his first administration created. So that's what this is, right? And so in the aftermath of the 2020, like during the 2020 election and after the 2020 election, CISA decided that they would take on sort of a rumor quashing responsibility because there were tons of rumors flying around about cybersecurity for voting machines, whether or not voting machines were connected to the internet, who was hacking into voter registration systems. Like that was just everywhere. And like the only agency that could have meaningfully sort of addressed that in a centralized way was CISA. And so they did that, combated a lot of the sort of misinformation that Trump and his campaign were spreading from inside the Trump administration. So that was not very popular. And then after the 2020 election, CISA put out a statement that said the 2020 election was like secure. It was the most secure election we've ever had. And Chris Krebs was very publicly fired right after that statement came out, in like sort of the lame duck days of the Trump administration, after he had been rejected for a second term, but had not left office yet. He was fired by tweet. It became a big thing. Krebs leaves CISA, obviously. He is fired. He starts his own cybersecurity firm. And that's what he has been doing for the last few years. And so nothing has happened with Chris Krebs in the last 4 years. There has never been any suggestion that he violated the law in any capacity. He was not investigated by the Biden administration. Trump did not begin an investigation of him in the several months he had to do that after Krebs was fired. And so this is really sort of Trump's attempt to continue to litigate the 2020 election. And so in an executive order specifically targeting Chris Krebs, he announced an investigation into CISA as an agency, which has really freaked people out, but into Chris Krebs specifically, and also removed his security clearance and then the security clearance of anybody who works at the security firm that he formerly ran. He has now left that security firm to focus on this investigation. But that was sort of the nature of the executive order.
You know, I feel like reading a portion of the executive order, I think kind of really hits home for especially in the context of everything that you just told us about. So I'm just going to read just a short section here. It says, Christopher Krebs, the former head of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Oh, you're right, agency. Chris Krebs is a significant bad faith actor who weaponized and abused his government authority. Krebs' misconduct involved the censorship of disfavored speech, implicating the 2020 election and COVID pandemic. CISA under Krebs suppressed conservative viewpoints under the guise of combating supposed disinformation and recruited and coerced major social media platforms to further its partisan mission. I mean, it goes on, but I'm guessing what was just written there doesn't comport well with what your understanding is of how central he was on maintaining the integrity of the elections, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, like there's very little. There's very little understanding of Krebs's actual role in that work, and I think that it is because there's so much space between what he actually did and what the executive order sort of publicly says he did. I think it's so obvious that this is sort of a messaging thing, right? This is not a good faith attempt to investigate an actual unlawful actor. This is very much just this is his ability. There's very little he can do to sort of continue to litigate 2020. This is one thing he can do, and so that's what he's doing.
You know, what's sad about this is, I mean, obviously, Trump is still sore about losing the 2020 election. Really sore.
Quite.
And there is a branch of Trump supporters that really still do think that he won, and his triumph in his third term, is just sort of a rebuke of the deep state. And I mean, I still know people that say the 2020 election was stolen. So I love for you to kind of make the best argument. I mean, it's 2025 now, but I feel like we still need to do this. What's the best argument you can make for why the 2020 election was not stolen? And where are some places that people can check just to fact check you?
Yeah. So, I think that it's really important for people to keep in mind that election results are first and foremost tallied and checked and canvassed at the local level. And there are polls that suggest that people really do trust their local election administrator. It's just that they don't trust everybody else's, right? And so that, I think, is a really interesting thing, right? And so when you say the 2020 election was stolen, what you're saying is my election administrator messed up, because that has to be what you're saying, right? Elections are conducted at the county level. And so if you trust your county election official, and most people do, and most people are rational and can like look at somebody in the face and be like, you're trustworthy, then the election results are trustworthy. The great thing about elections, and the thing that I like as a nerd love most about them, is that there is a paper trail for everything. Like everything is data and everything is measurable. And so at the end of the day, unless you live in the one state in the country that still uses DRE machines, Louisiana is like the only state that does not produce paper backups for its voting systems. Unless you live in Louisiana, you can audit anything you want, right? In elections, like the paper is there for you, and federal law requires that we hold on to that paper for 21 months at least after elections. So this is all checkable. And the vast majority of states require at least partial recounts to make sure that there are no problems. And so the sort of election night results that you see is like the first slice of the checking that your local election administrator is doing. There's going to be a canvas. There's going to be results reporting up to the state. The state's going to fact check that. Then they're going to report that. This is the leveled out thing with huge numbers of people quality checking as it goes. And if at any point you, individual human being, are like, I don't think that that's correct, you can request the ballot images and you can do an audit yourself. And so this does not have to be this thing that happens behind closed doors. I think of all processes that happen in our bureaucracy, this one is the most transparent. And I just think people don't realize that.
Yeah, I really don't think that they do. You know, I'm thinking about this use of the executive orders in a way that is, very targeted at these these individuals and these companies or these firms, lawyer firms, and even thinking about. So I was looking some of this up, and in a March 14th, 2025 speech at the Justice Department, Trump stated essentially that people who did this, essentially rigged the election in 2020, should go to jail. Is that, what do we make of these statements that Trump is saying? Is that out of context? Is that like a misrepresentation of what he's saying? And with that, like, is there precedent for this in terms of presidents sending, like making executive orders against specific people? And I'm not saying you're an executive order expert. I just don't know if you have knowledge about that in this area.
Yeah, certainly. Just as a overall, no, this is not normal. There is not a heck of a lot of precedent for this in American history. We have not previously seen executive orders that are this targeted, right? There have been very narrow executive orders before that address some very specific provision of immigration law, for example, like something that like we as a country and as like a court system are squarely in agreement that this is an executive power, right? There have been really specific, narrow executive orders, but these are so targeted at individuals in a way, and law firms, as you say, in a way that is not typical and is not there, and there is no precedent for in American history.
I am curious about voting machines, kind of post. What's the name of the voting lawsuit? Fox 1 billion, whatever.
Dominion, yes.
Yeah, like who's making voting machines now?
Same dudes
Sure.
are making voting machines. I think that I know I'm such a nerd, but I really love talking about the market for voting technology because it is so small. Like I think people don't really take into consideration that like the market there are three companies more or less that produce all of the voting machines in the United States. There are a smattering of other really small companies that make things like e-poll books and voter registration software and stuff like that, right? But this is a really small market. Like we spend as a country about $300 million a year on voting technology. By comparison, we spend about $1 billion a year on pets, on Halloween costumes for pets. So like this is the tiniest industry in the world. And so big companies like IBM used to produce voting machines. And then they were like, why are we doing this? We keep getting sued and we're not making any money. And so now the market is just tiny, tiny, tiny. And there's not enough money in it to encourage growth or innovation. And so, Dominion got probably its biggest payday ever from that lawsuit. Like it was $768 million or something. That is much more than they make in a decade as a company.
Yeah, no
for
kidding.
all of their sales.
I should make sure that we clarify. You're not downing on people that want to dress up their pets in costumes, right?
Oh no, I dressed Walter up as a sea turtle just this past Halloween. So we should just continue to
just like
pour
don't
money into that great American industry.
Yeah.
That's Halloween.
So I want to kind of close this out, just talking a little bit about I don't know, job satisfaction, morale of poll workers. I mean, I remember the first time we had you on the show, you were like a rabid like voter worker proselytizer.
Yeah.
And yeah, and you still are. So like I'm curious, like how are people doing out there? I mean, especially given all the Rudy Giuliani lawsuit stuff and just the way that voters or vote workers have been treated in the past. Like what are you hearing?
It's rough out there for an election worker. I would not want to be doing this job. I think we're sort of approaching kind of a perfect storm here, which is that we were already going to see a natural turnover as sort of the baby boomer generation retired from these jobs that they have held for years, right? Like these have historically been jobs that you take and you have for decades, right? Like these have been sleepy bureaucratic positions. Like the number of election officials that I've talked to who are like, oh yeah, like I started as the deputy clerk when I was 18 and then I became the clerk when I was 30 and I've been the clerk ever since, right? Like, or like I was a stay-at-home mom and then my kids went to college and so I decided to run for clerk and so now I'm the clerk, right? Like that is what these positions have always been. And so people who took these positions, like because they wanted to serve their communities and they wanted to kind of be in these anonymous, very bureaucratic roles, found themselves all of a sudden as like the talk of the town in 2020. And that was foreign, that was uncomfortable, obviously. They were getting threats all of a sudden, and they were super freaked out by that. And I think that, there were larger politicians and like they had Senate hearings about the threats that election workers were getting. And these senators were like, why is this a big deal? Well, I mean, if you're a senator, you've got a whole group of people surrounding you. If you get a death threat, there's a thing you can do about that. You send it to a designated person. You've got security. If you are a deputy clerk in, Austin, Texas, who you going to? You're not going to anybody, right? Like there, you do not have security. You don't even have an IT person. So like
you're going to the store to get a gun.
You are protecting your damn self, right? And so I like, it's a different security landscape for these folks. And so I think like, on top of the fact that these people are retiring, it is now a totally different job than it used to be. Right? It used to be this thing that was like quiet, reliable. You got county benefits forever. It was like an awesome job, especially if you were a woman in a small town. And now it is the opposite of that. And so I think that the whole landscape has just shifted under these folks' feet. And some of them have really risen to the occasion and have like learned to talk to the media and have learned to like deal with the spotlight. And then some of them are still freaked out by it. And I don't blame them.
Yeah, I mean, I would not want that position. I know that's the hard thing, right? Then what kind of people are going to get the position? What incentives are there for it? All these things create a lot of uncertainties, and there are unintended consequences that happen in all of this. And I guess we're going to see how that all pans out. And with that, what are you hopeful for, and what are you concerned about, not hopeful for, in terms of election integrity over the next, over this administration, this next few years?
Yeah. So, I am hopeful that, I think we were all really expecting it to be a really difficult legislative season for voting and elections. It is May. Texas's legislature is about to wrap. Things are not as bad as they could have been in terms of like the amount of radical voting changes. And when I say bad, what I mean is like, anytime you change anything about voting, it's just chaos, right? And so any change, like, doesn't matter what it is, right? Radical amounts of it produce chaos. And so there has not been a lot of chaos producing this time around. This could change, right? Like I'm saying this to you as of mid-May. So that's all I'm being held accountable for. The thing that I'm not as hopeful for, is this clerk issue, right? I think that we're talking about a group of people who make such little money. Like these people make less than classroom teachers in public schools. We're talking about people who make $16 an hour and work part-time. And so we're asking of a job that attracts that level of employee, right? Because that's what the job is. We want them to be IT specialists and like make sure that the voting machines are perfect. And we want them to make sure that everybody's a citizen. And we want them to make sure that they're checking birth certificates. It's sort of crazy, like all of the things that we're expecting out of this municipal employee that we pay $16 an hour. And so that is the thing I am most pessimistic about, is our ability to sort of attract and retain talent into those positions that just seem impossible to fill.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would share that concern with what you've just outlined. I mean, I couldn't even imagine wanting to go and face the pressure of that and liability and all this stuff for what? And then you're asking them to do it, because of their patriotism. And of course, that's great. But again, if they're going to be treated in this way, it's just not enough. It's not enough protection.
It's not enough. And, it creates a huge disparity between big counties and small counties, right? In big counties. So for example, like Dallas County, we have a full-time election administrator, Hyder Garcia. He makes a perfectly good salary for the amount of thing, like I don't know, $150,000 or something. Like he is qualified. He is like, we know that he can do this. It's all he does. He only manages elections. But in most rural counties, election administration is like part of what the county clerk does. And that job includes like 18 other responsibilities. So like business registration and land titles. Like they're basically the secretary for the whole county, and they just happen to also do voter registration and election administration. And so, it's an incredibly hard job, and we're asking them to just spend an incredible amount of time on something that for most election administrators in the United States is only like the smallest percentage of their overall responsibilities.
Man, that is wild. We appreciate you coming on so much, Jessica. It's been a pleasure as always to talk with you and to, pick your brain a little bit about these topics. How can people connect with your work? Where would you send them to keep up with all this exciting voting news?
Thank you for asking me that. They can go to votebeat.org. There's a button at the top that says newsletter, and you should subscribe to the newsletter. That's the best way to keep up with us. You get it every Saturday morning. You can wake up to some hot voting analysis. That's how I like to start my weekends. So
I'm doing hot yoga and hot voting analysis at the same time.
Take that to your weekend parties. You'll be the talk of the place.
And ask people to start being clerks.
Yes.
Oh man, that's good. Well, thank you again. Yes. Thank you again, Jessica. It's been a real pleasure. And to our listeners and viewers, guys, thanks so much for joining us again. We try to get this great content out to you, so make sure you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share it with someone who needs to see it. Maybe your Uncle Ralph, who still thinks that the 2020 election is stolen. Send it over to him. You guys can have a great conversation next time you get together. And guys, until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Have a good one. Hey there, Josh Burtram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.